Darshanwar, and with my co-presenters Bhumi Bagohil and Dhatri Parmar, we are presenting a presentation on comparative literature in India, an article by Amya Dev. So let's get started. So Amya Dev's article, Comparative Literature in India, dwells into the complexities of defining Indian literature amidst its linguistic diversity. It proposes an interliterary process framework that highlights translations and cultural exchanges as essential to understanding Indian literature in dynamics and interconnected way. In the article, Dev has focuses on a critical question that how can Indian literature with their linguistic and cultural diversity be studied collectively without erasing their individual identity. The objectives of this study is to analyze the relationship between unity and diversity in Indian literatures and to explore the role of comparative literature in fostering interliterary understanding. To address this, he used the methodology of analysis of India's linguistic and literary traditions through historical, cultural, and post-structuralist lens, and engagement with the concept like interliterariness and differential multilogues. By study of this article, the key finding that reveals is that Indian literature is not static entity. It is evolving process shaped by translation and interactions and exchanges. And by recognizing linguistic plurality, it enhances the study of sharp and cultural narratives. Key points are that India's linguistic diversity challenged the idea of singular Indian literature. In the article, he says that it is not Indian literature, it is literatures, because there are many dialects and languages are there. And India does not hold only a single literature, it has literatures. There is a debate between unity and diversity. In the article, we get to see the criticism of Indian post-structuralism for being too theoretical and it is detached from practice. They propose to view Indian literature as an interconnected literary process. The article criticized of creating English archive of Indian literature through translation, as he says that by translating Indian literature to English, it loses its originality. Key arguments, Dev's arguments are that Indian literature is not single homogeneous entity, but it comprises diverse Indian literatures. And viewing Indian literature as entirely separate is problematic. There are significant connections and interconnections among them. Diversity and distinctiveness should coexist with the recognition of shared Indian commonality. He advocates for an interliterary approach that highlights interactions, overlaps, and the thematic connections across Indian literature. Process of exchange, evolution, and it is not static or and fixed concept. Dev has used many references of various scholars. I have here presented a few of them. In first is Guru Bhagat Singh. Guru Bhagat Singh is criticizing Western approaches, and it says that it is inadequate for Indian diversity. And second is Jaidev. He criticized Indian fiction's trend of existentialist aestheticism, and he emphasized the importance of fluidity and multiplicity in Indian literature, resisting narrative of fixed unity. Last is Azaz Ahmad. He highlights the limitation in defining Indian literature compared to the richness of individual literature in 22 languages, that is officially India's 22 languages in the constitution. And he opposes the nation-state driven identity construction in literature. Through the study of this article, I get to have many deep understanding. The learning outcomes are following that I have now deeper understanding of how diverse and complex Indian literature are and why they can't be seen as one unified entity. I learned to appreciate the balance between recognizing the distinctiveness of each literature and identifying common thread that connect them. The idea of interliterary process helped me see Indian literature as a dynamic and evolving interaction between language and cultures. I realized the importance of avoiding homogenization, which can overshadow the richness of individual literature. And the last is the key perspective that I have briefly presented of Guru Bhagat Singh, Jaidev, and Azaz Ahmad taught me to approach Indian literature with the respect of diversity and context. So that is from my side. Now I would like to invite my fellow presenter Bhumi to continue the presentation.
Thank you so much, Darshan, for providing that overview. Now let us dive into the very first concept given by Amya Dev, which is the problem of unity in diversity. Now, as we all know, India has this unparalleled linguistic diversity. There are officially 22 recognized languages. Unofficially, there are more than 221 other languages, and there are many different regional dialects. Now, because of this linguistic diversity, Amya Dev presents the question, is Indian literature in the singular a valid category, or are we rather to speak of Indian literatures in plural? Now, this problem of unity in diversity brings that there is hegemonic apprehensions. We see that the dominant languages often overshadow the other regional languages. And here, Amya Dev also suggests the problem in Sahitya Academy's motto, which is Indian literature is one, though written in many languages. And as Amya Dev says, that there is hegemonic apprehensions that many other dominant languages, for example, individualities of diverse literatures. And because of this, Anya Dev gives a retort to Sahitya Academy's motto, which is Indian literature is one because it is written in many languages. Now, based on this, Guru Bhagat Singh gives the differential multilogue. This concept is an alternative to dialogue. Dialogue, as you know, is a conventional two-way communication method. Multilogue suggests engagement among multiple perspectives and voices. This concept given by Guru Bhagat Singh helps us understanding Indian diversity without sacrificing the individuality of particulars. Here we see Guru Bhagat Singh gives a rejection of French and American school. He suggests that Indian literature requires its own theories, and that is why he sees comparative literature as an exercise in differential multilogue. Now, this concept given by Guru Bhagat Singh is based on post-structuralist suspicion. This means that when there is the idea of unifying the languages or making or doing this, like capturing all the literatures under the term of Indian literature, there is this problem of that it is controlled by the center or the powerful people, and because of this, there can be the problem of accumulation of power, and because of this, the answer to this problem is to decentralize the power. And here we see Guru Bhagat Singh gives difference as an inclusion rather than an exclusionary force. We see that this concept aligns with post-structuralism, and Indian literature. Guru Bhagat Singh says that Indian literature should have mutual engagement without the need of hierarchical categorization. Again, Amya Dev criticizes this post-structuralism of India because it tends to emphasize theoretical constructs at the expense of practical application. We see that it is heavily based on theory, and these practical applications of these theory are not present. Scholars often attempt to force literature into pre-existing theoretical frameworks. They don't make a framework based on literature; rather, they borrow the frameworks from other places and try to force Indian literature into this. And this leads to an abundance of meta theory, which is meta theory is basically theorizing about the theory itself. Because of this, there is not a deeper engagement of work and text, and there is not this deeper understanding, but rather a shallow work of research. And here, Amya Dev raises the question of situs and theory. Now, what is situs? Situs is a location where the theory is originating, or the location of the theory scholar. Now, Amya Dev says that this situs is as important as theorization. He goes on to say that a wrong theory is bad, but a theory from a wrong situs is equally bad. And after explaining this, Amya Dev goes on to the scholar Jaydev's concept. Jaydev, while criticizing existentialist aestheticism in comparative Indian fiction, develops the concept of Indian sensus communis, which is basically a commonality of Indian literature. Now, this commonality is not just like a stereotype. It is this cultural commonality that allows interconnectedness without erasing individual identities. And we see that it is rooted in similar social and historical experiences. Jaydev goes on to say that the pre-modern foundation of these commonalities he first discusses, which is oral and performing traditions and ease of intertranslatability. During pre-modern India, there used to be this ease of intertranslatability. The translating of works was quite easy, and at the same time, these stories originated from oral or performing traditions. So this is like a shared historical experience of Indian literatures, and we see it from the example of Bhakti movement. So that movement inspired many works in different languages, and here Amya Dev suggests that Jaydev's this concept is only working in pre-modern time, because if this is implied in today's time, then there are dangers of nation state, creating a nation state. The concept of nation state is more elaborated by Ejaz Ahmad in his work in Theory, Classes, Nation and Literatures. Ejaz Ahmad says that syndicated Indian literature is often an unsatisfactory categorization. It is not a proper categorization, and there is something remains. And he rejects the analogy between Indian literature and European literature. Many times people compare that Indian literature, the title Indian literature is like that of title European literature. But European literature emerges as an umbrella term, and Indian literature becomes this very narrow categorization. And because of this, as we saw, there are minor languages are often ignored or not counted. So this happens in syndicated Indian literature. And Ahmad also goes on to say that Indian archives, which is that Indian literature has archives of 22 major recognized languages. So there is this difference in archive, and he suggests that we should make one archive. But here also the problem arises that to make this one archive, one way is that we translate all this work in English language. Now, this is non-hegemonious because it removes the different archives. But at the same time, it is hegemonizing by latent colonial attitude, because use of English is heavily relied upon. And this concept of English archive of Indian literature was suggested a few years back by V.K. Gokak and Sujit Mukherjee. And they say that Indian literature there should be development of an Indo-English corpus of literature that was created out of English translations of major texts from major Indian languages. Here also we see that Ahmad criticizes this idea as well, and he is not as opposed to English language as we can say, for example, Kuki Batyongo, who suggests that there should be a removal of English department. Ahmad does not take that radical stance, but at the same time, there is this problem that if the translations are done in English, then it is okay. But let's say that the translations are done in Hindi. Then again, there is this problem of hegemonizing, that Hindi would emerge as a dominant language, and one way or the other languages will be crushed under it. At the end of this, Amya Dev says that Indian literature is not an entity but an interliterary condition, which means that it is like all these cultures, all these different literatures are influencing each other, and there is this interliterary condition among them. More on that from here on, my co-presenter Dhatri will continue. But before that, I would like to share my learning outcome of this article, which is that it helped in understanding the significance of interliterary interactions, including translations and cross-linguistic influences, in shaping Indian literature as an ongoing process. It also helped in evaluating the role of post-structuralism and nationalism in Indian literary discourses and the implication of constructing Indian literature. And it helped in appreciating the historical depth and cultural specificity of Indian literary practices. From here, Dhatri will continue.
Thank you, Bhumi and Darshan, for combining all the arguments. Now, to move on, Amya Dev presented various arguments from the scholars. And next in line, the scholar is Swapan Majumdar. Swapan Majumdar, in his book Comparative Literature, an Indian Dimension, talks about how the Indian literature is neither a simple unity nor a pure diversity. He said it, but rather, I quote, a systematic whole where many subsystems interact towards one in continuous and never-ending dialectic, unquote. So, by this argument, Amya Dev takes a middle ground that, with the help of his argument, he said that Indian comparative literature is unified, but it has a diversity, and we have to take a middle ground while we have to acknowledge the diversity and we have to find the unity as well. Next in line, Amya Dev used the argument of Shishir Kumar Das, and he also highlighted his contribution. Shishir Kumar Das created a comprehensive chronological history of Indian literature. Basically, he's making a framework with which we can understand the importance of Indian comparative literatures. So he used three key arguments. So he made a team-based data collection covering all 22 recognized literatures, all the languages from there. So basically, Shishir Kumar Das is making a group of people, and they are interacting with each other to create and finding a unity within the diverse Indian languages. They documented various literary events, publications, reviews, and translation. Now, this framework helped to find, and they also use the social events of literary events, like, for example, using fiction books, that how a partition is captured in various languages. Now, that helps to understanding how Indian comparative literatures is sharing a common threads and how there is a diverse social event or themes are exploring in that. So, this help in finding, as Amya Dev argues, that patterns of profense and metaphense across different literatures. So, this very framework helped Amya Dev to understand the commonalities of 19th century literature while avoiding forced unification. So, time and again, we try to share unification, that Indian languages have a unification, it has one. So, Amya Dev counter argued this very argument of having a unification. For supporting this, Amya Dev says, I quote, Das's work on literature of the 19th century in India does not designate this Indian literature a category by itself. Rather, the work suggests a rationale for the proposed research, the objective being to establish whether a pattern can be found through the ages, unquote. So, they've tried to find a pattern, a similar kind of a pattern within the various languages of the India. Next in line is K.M. George's work. In the article, normally we are finding positive as well as negatives, and like what are the opposing ideas within the field. So, similar way, Amya Dev used the argument of K.M. George, that what we should not do. Now, K.M. George earlier, before the Shishir Kumar Das, did the framework of the comparing the Indian literatures. So, what he did is he covered the only 15 languages of literature instead of recognized all Indian languages. That is something like narrow downing the very idea of Indian literatures. And with this, there is an restrictive generic bias coming, because we are using only 15 languages of India, avoiding all other minor languages. So that showed a Western hegemonic categorization given by the Western approaches. So to counter argue, Amya Dev used the work of K.M. George, and he says, I quote, poetry, for instance, was discussed in terms of traditional and modern, but as if traditional was exclusively Indian and modern the result of Western impact, unquote. So Amya Dev criticized to take an approach traditional versus modernity, where every traditional thing is going to be in Indian and every modern thing will be going to be an imitation of the Western. And now that is what another translation studies scholar E.V. Ramakrishnan argues, that Indian comparative Indian literature has its own modernity, its own kind of a socio-political condition which help to develop Indian literatures. So it also lacks a true comparative analysis. Like, what comparison was only suggested, that is, the reader was required to make whatever comparison was necessary or appropriate, unquote. So now this is taking as an imitation of the Western methodology of doing a comparative analysis. So that's why Amya Dev provides counter argument that what we should not do while we are doing a comparative Indian comparative literature studies. Next in line, he provides an argument by Umashankar Joshi and Anant Murthy, and he said that as a president of an Indian National Comparative Literature Association, he represented the unity approach, and he provided also institutional framework to study the Indian literature. So, to tie everything up together and key findings of the article, this article proposes that Indian literature should be understood as an interliterary condition rather than fixed entity. This article also emphasized the importance of a citus as being a colonial identity and having in different languages. The citus is important in doing a theatrical study of this comparative literature. Comparative literature provides frameworks for understanding unity, diversity, dialectic. We appreciate the various dialects of the India, at the same time finding the commonalities and inter-Indian reception and translation, that how various languages, for example, our Hindi, Gujarati, have other influence of the Persian languages or Farsi languages within this. Indian literature as an ever in making, it is not a static point, but still it is an ongoing process. As Michel Foucault argues in dialogism, that there is an ongoing happening within the comparative literature. And it also emphasized need to develop a comparative approach specific to Indian context. In this article, some of the limitation was noted by Amyadev, and this limitation are a challenge of dealing with multiple languages and translation, which is kind of a challenge for a scholar in the comparative literature. We need many people to come up together and having a dialogue and making a kind of a theory. There is, of course, as Bhumi mentioned, that risk of hegemonic approach through English or Hindi translation with doing archives. And there is also difficulty in balancing the university and diversity without comparing either. So talking about my personal learning outcome, then I personally have a narrow idea of the comparative literature. And the very idea of world literature was very much absent while we are making presentation of all these last 3 semesters. So this helped me to understand what the world literature is, and also the applying these comparative approaches. Like I understand that what the comparative Indian literature is. So there is also a different kind of genre altogether in comparative literature. I also learned how the role of translation is necessary in doing the comparative analysis, because a text written in various languages, whether it is Mexican, Russian, but the translation is the only means of way through which we can explore the other world literature. So that also helped me by reading this article. I also learned to identify commonalities without forcing uniformity. We have basically the idea of having a unity, but at the same time appreciating diversity. That's what I also learned. I also identify the shared historical influence by acknowledging regional unities. And at the end, and most important, I recognize the importance of citus in literary analysis in a practical life as well. These are our references, and thank you. Now, if you have any question, feel free to ask.
Yes, Doctor, my question is, how does Amyadev's argument for identifying common threads across Indian literature enhance the scope of comparative Indian literary studies?
Okay. Amyadev argues that there is a common thread, and this we can find from these religious literature, or we can say mythical literature. Now, Ramayana and Mahabharata is spreading across the India, and different languages have a different kind of their stories. So, if we are even taking an example of Ramayana, then various languages have their own Ramayana, but there's very shared thread between this is Ramayana. So with the help of that, we can find that how Malayali languages are portraying the characters of Ramayana, how Gujarati writers such as Draupadi or Gunvancha writing about Ramayana and Draupadi, how they are portraying characters and themes. Similar way, how the South Indian part or North Indian part using the same kind of an we can say archetype of religious or mythical stories to write down. So this can help to find also doing comparative studies, that how one language is showing culture and what is there and what is missing in different within the Indian languages of the India.
My question is for you, Bhumi. To what extent does Dev's idea of Indian literature ever in the remaking reflect a dynamic form of unity?
Okay, so the question is that to what extent does Dev's idea of Indian literature ever in the remaking reflect the dynamic form of unity? And my answer would be that as we saw that it is an evolving entity, it is not fixed, and because of this, because it is not fixed and it is always evolving, this means that there is always influence on each other. All the literatures influence each other through their literary forms, their genres, their thematic concerns, and their you can say the subject matter. So because of this influence, we see that there is this dynamic form of unity, that they are interconnected and they are one, but at the same time, we cannot generalize them under this one category. So we see that it is because it is ever in the remaking, it keeps on influencing each other, and there is this form of unity. So I hope that answers your question.